case of Mohammed Shamji, a brilliant surgeon, father of many, and ruthless criminal, highlights a tragic reality. Victims of domestic violence sometimes not only endure abuse, humiliation, and beatings, but also blame themselves for what is happening. Each of these cases, when brought to the public's attention, is condemned, causing confusion and leading to many questions. Why does the victim allow themselves to be treated this way? Why don't they tell anyone? Why don't they leave their abuser? Contrary to the popular belief that physical violence occurs primarily in dysfunctional families, statistics show that such incidents do not depend on the social status of spouses, their position in society, or their job titles. Mohammed Shamji and Alana Frick Shamji were not only outstanding doctors, but also true luminaries of science. Mohammed made a name for himself in neurosurgery and the treatment of spine injuries and diseases, while his wife was an equally renowned family doctor with a PhD. For years, they both saved other people's lives, yet few knew what was happening in their private lives. This story shocked the entire world, and the accused admitted his guilt only to spare his 12-year-old daughter, who had accidentally witnessed her mother's death, from having to testify in court. Notably, shortly before the tragedy, Alana had posted a photo of her husband in a kimono on social media, taken during one of his jiu-jitsu training sessions, with a joking comment that this doctor could not only heal but also break a neck. This post turned out to be prophetic. Alana Frick, life before meeting Mohammed. Alana Christina Frick was born in September 1977 in the Canadian city of Windsor, located in Ontario in the southern part of the country. She was the younger of two daughters in the family of George and Anna Frick, who emigrated from Croatia to North America in the early 1970s. Alana was raised alongside her older sister, Caroline, with whom she was very close from an early age. The birth of Alana was seen as a miracle by her parents, as Anna had serious complications after her first pregnancy, and doctors had said she would never conceive again. Alana's parents worked at a large car factory, striving to provide their daughters with everything they needed and to give them a good education. Both sisters were smart and did well in school, but Alana stood out for her determination and passion for learning. She spent nearly all her free time reading books, and she also managed to attend a dance studio, practice gymnastics, and compete in track and field. During middle school, Alana chose to work during summer breaks to help her family. She worked in cornfields and even then tried to manage her budget wisely. Alana excelled in math and other sciences, and by high school, she had decided to pursue a career in medicine and become a doctor. She graduated from high school as the top student and enrolled in a prestigious medical university without issue. Around this time, she also began a romantic relationship with a man named Matthew Ryan, whom she had known since high school and who was now studying in the same department. Their student romance lasted until graduation, but afterward, Frick decided to go to Ottawa and continue her studies in the capital's university residency program. Her boyfriend settled for a job at a local hospital and didn't consider furthering his studies. Alana's and Matthew's relationship continued long distance and lasted until nearly 2002. They even planned to marry, but eventually decided to remain friends. By then, Alana was interning at one of the country's top clinics and aimed to earn a doctorate, while Matthew hadn't advanced in his career. Love at first sight. In February 2003, during a night shift at the hospital, Alana went to the staff room and saw a new colleague who immediately caught her attention. The young man, Mohammed Shamji, was just a year older than Alana and was doing his residency in the neurosurgery department. Mohammed came from a family of prominent doctors. He was born and raised in Ottawa in a family of the renowned surgeon Farid Shamji and his talented psychiatrist wife, Edith. Mohammed's older brother Ali was an experienced medical biophysicist. Both brothers graduated from Yale University, and Mohammed later returned to Canada to earn his doctorate from Western Ontario's Research University. Mohammed was also interested in the blonde, but initially, he made no effort to approach her. Alana, however, fell for this tall, dark-skinned man at first sight and tried to attract his attention. Soon, Mohammed asked his colleagues for her number and sent her a message, and their relationship began to blossom. Alana considered Mohammed a shy and modest man. He rarely took the initiative, felt uncomfortable on dates, jumped from topic to topic, or fell silent, appearing detached and introverted. Later, it turned out these oddities weren't due to shyness, but rather a lack of interest. Mohammed was already seeing another woman, but for some reason, he kept this from his infatuated colleague. When Frick discovered the existence of a rival, she resolved to win over Mohammed and become his one and only. Their relationship was rocky during the first year, with the couple breaking up 3 times before rekindling, mainly due to Alana's persistence. Her parents were aware of this and urged her to leave Mohammed, but she stood firm, believing she had found her one true love. Alana often pampered her lover with gifts, made surprises, and brought him home-cooked meals. Mohammed seemed to just let himself be loved, readily accepting everything but reciprocating only occasionally. This one-sided game appeared to create an emotional dependence on Mohammed for Alana. Unplanned pregnancy, wedding, and the beginning of a nightmare. In the summer of 2004, Frick informed her partner that they were going to have a child. This news came as a surprise to both of them, causing more anxiety than joy. Nonetheless, Mohammed, raised in a strict conservative Muslim family, felt compelled to follow tradition and marry the mother of his child before its birth. In early September that year, the couple had a wedding with 2 ceremonies. The first adhered to all cultural customs respected by the groom's family, and the second took place among the couple's friends at one of the trendiest restaurant complexes. The newlyweds seemed happy and in love, but no one could have imagined that their marriage would be the start of a nightmare that would end in tragedy. The couple moved into a spacious house in one of Ottawa's prestigious neighborhoods. In January 2005, they welcomed their first child, a daughter named Yasmina. Unfortunately, the birth of their daughter didn't strengthen their marriage. The young father was entirely focused on his career and planned to continue his education, with his wife and newborn daughter taking a back seat. Moreover, Mohammed didn't hide his disappointment, as he had hoped for a son. After the birth of her child, Alana went on maternity leave, focusing on household chores and caring for her daughter. This irritated her husband, who, after returning from work, would retreat to his home office, spending little time with his wife and child. Over time, he became increasingly nervous and irritable, criticizing his wife's appearance, refusing to eat what she cooked, and calling her stupid and useless. Alana tried not to complain about her family issues, not even to close friends or parents. However, one day while talking to her mother on the phone, Mohammed, returning home in a bad mood, began berating and insulting his wife, which her mother overheard. She tried to defend her daughter, but her son-in-law blamed Alana for their crumbling marriage. Anna tried to convince her daughter to file for divorce and leave the man treating her this way. But Alana flatly refused, saying she loved her husband and would handle everything. She kept quiet about Mohammed's physical abuse, simply because the verbal abuse no longer seemed enough for him. In the summer of 2005, the situation spiraled out of control when Mohammed, in a fit of rage, punched Alana in the face, breaking her nose. Alana, with her baby in hand, fled to friends and filed a police report for domestic violence. She also decided to get a divorce and leave the man she had married for good. Unexpectedly, Mohammed began begging his wife to return, promising never to hit her again or even raise his voice. He swore he would change and that their family life would be everything Alana had ever dreamed of, and he would control his emotions. Shamji seemed sincerely remorseful, but this behavior was driven by certain circumstances. The young neurosurgeon was preparing to enroll at Duke University, aiming to earn his doctorate, and a criminal conviction could end his promising medical career. Mohammed cared only for himself and his future, but he succeeded in convincing Alana to drop the charges and not file for divorce. She even agreed to follow him to the United States, to North Carolina, where he was to continue his studies and earn a degree. Period of relative calm. Friends and family were baffled by why Alana didn't leave her tyrant husband and withdrew her police report. When she announced her intention to move to another country with Mohammed, they tried to dissuade her, but Alana stood firm. She was smart, educated, driven, and ambitious, financially independent, and capable of achieving any career goal. But her destructive relationship and emotional dependence on her husband were stronger. She was ready to abandon everything and sacrifice all for a marriage that didn't bring her happiness, only suffering. However, after moving to the United States, a period of relative calm came to their family. Muhammad was admitted to an elite biomedical engineering program, difficult to enter due to the intense competition. Meanwhile, Alana enrolled in a master's program at the School of Policy and Health at Duke University, receiving a scholarship covering her tuition. The couple seemed to reconnect, spending more time together. Their relationship became stable enough that they decided to have a second child. In August 2007, they welcomed their younger daughter, Fiza. However, Muhammad again couldn't hide his disappointment, as he had hoped for a son. What does the happy family keep secret? In late summer 2009, the couple and their children returned to Canada, settling back into their home in Ottawa. This time, Alana decided not to stay on maternity leave for long, and she quickly secured a position at a prestigious hospital as a family doctor, earning a solid reputation. Meanwhile, her husband balanced work, studies, and teaching at the university. In the late 2000s, social media was gaining popularity worldwide, and the couple started a personal blog showcasing a seemingly ideal family in every sense. They posted photos of their travels, spoke about achievements in science, flaunted their luxurious lifestyle in a lavish home, attended prestigious conferences and trendy resorts, and spent time with friends at expensive restaurants. From the outside, they appeared to be a happy, successful, wealthy, and deeply in love couple with no problems, but their followers couldn't fathom what was hidden behind this facade. In reality, Muhammad again distanced himself from his wife, continuing to exert strict control over her. He carefully monitored who she interacted with, what she wore, and even checked her email and social media accounts. He openly criticized her appearance, style, and parenting methods. But Alana preferred to remain silent. Tension and aggression from Shamji grew, with him yelling at his wife and blaming her for all their arguments and discord. In 2011, the talented neurosurgeon was offered a fellowship in spinal surgery at one of the largest medical centers in Calgary. He accepted the offer, but this time he went alone, leaving his family in Ottawa since Alana couldn't leave her job. For over a year, they maintained a long-distance relationship, but during one visit home, Muhammad left his laptop on, and Alana saw a message from a woman on his social media. The content suggested they were romantically involved. When Alana directly confronted Muhammad, he didn't deny it, admitting to having an affair. This was another painful blow for Frick, and she again considered divorcing her rude, unfaithful husband. Her family was sure she wouldn't forgive him this time. Surprisingly, Alana gave their family another last chance. Muhammad promised to end his affair and said they would start fresh in Toronto, where he had been offered a prestigious, well-paying job. Domestic violence and revenge affair. Shortly after moving, Muhammad expressed his continued desire for a son, suggesting they try again. Alana agreed, thinking that having a third child might help solidify their family. In October 2013, they welcomed a long-awaited boy named Marius. The father was happy, but his attitude toward his wife remained unchanged. Over the next few years, Shamji focused entirely on his medical career, becoming an accredited neurosurgeon with a reputation for handling the toughest and most hopeless cases that other doctors avoided. Frick also advanced, becoming a delegate for the Ontario Medical Association. However, tension between the couple began to rise again. Muhammad didn't stop at rudeness and insults, but resumed hitting the mother of his children. During a family ski vacation, Alana had a deep cut on her arm that required stitches, along with other injuries, but she claimed she hurt herself skiing. After returning home, Alana confided in her best friend that all the injuries were inflicted by her husband, following another argument over a newly discovered affair he had with a colleague. Alana had overheard part of a phone conversation between Muhammad and his mistress, and when she asked him about it, he beat her. Her friend again suggested she divorce him, and when Alana refused, joked that she should get a revenge affair. The women laughed, but the hurt wife might have thought it was a good way to get back at her cheating husband. The summer of 2016 was challenging. While the older kids were at camp and the youngest stayed with maternal grandparents, the couple's relationship completely fell apart. In early September, they celebrated their 12th wedding anniversary, sharing the news on social media. But a week later, they spoke of divorce. Muhammad refused, stating he was content, while a desperate Alana had an affair with a colleague who had shown interest in her. She immersed herself in this new relationship, basking in the care and attention of another man, enjoying the long-forgotten feeling of being loved and desired. Did she run away with her lover, leaving her kids behind? On November 25, 2016, a heated argument broke out in the family when Alana told her husband that divorce was inevitable. The next day, she met with a divorce lawyer and then left for a 3-day medical conference in another city. During this time, Muhammad sent her messages, pleading with her to reconsider and save the marriage, at least for the children. On November 30th, Alana returned home and made her final phone call to her parents. Her voice revealed some anxiety, but she assured them everything was fine. Later, it was discovered that she had tried calling the police that evening, but in her panic, misdialed one digit, leading to a tragic outcome. On December 1st, Anna couldn't reach her daughter, so she called her son-in-law to find out what had happened. Muhammad calmly told her that his wife had packed her bags in the middle of the night and fled to her lover, abandoning him and the children. Her parents didn't believe him, knowing their daughter would never leave her daughters and young son like that. They contacted a close friend of Alana's who lived nearby, asking her to discreetly watch the Shamji home while they took the first flight to Toronto and reported their daughter's disappearance to the police. Alana's friend reported that her car was still in the driveway, which only heightened the family's concern. Upon arriving at their daughter's house, they found nothing immediately suspicious. But Muhammad was agitated, saying they had called the police unnecessarily and insisting that Alana was with her lover. He had already told the police this version when they visited earlier, following the report of Mrs. Frick Shamji's disappearance. Body in a suitcase. In the early morning hours of December 2nd, a man walking his dog along the river, about 24 miles from Shamji's home, saw a large suitcase at the base of the bridge. He was initially going to pass it by, but curiosity got the better of him, especially since the suitcase looked almost new. When he opened it, he was horrified to find the lifeless body of a blonde woman inside. He immediately notified the police, and the suitcase and body were sent to the medical examiner's office for identification and to determine the cause and circumstances of death. There were no issues with identification, as the criminal hadn't even bothered to remove the luggage tag from the suitcase from Alana's recent trip to a conference. Her parents confirmed her identity. The body had multiple abrasions and bruises, but the cause of death was mechanical asphyxiation and a broken neck. The woman was dressed in pajamas and had no shoes, and based on the position of her body, she had been placed in the suitcase immediately after her death. The young witness, Muhammad, was arrested that evening at a coffee shop where he was meeting with a lawyer. It was evident he was planning to leave the country, but he didn't have the chance. He was charged with first-degree murder, but the neurosurgeon denied any involvement. However, a horrific detail of the incident emerged. It turned out that the couple's eldest daughter, 12-year-old Yasmina, had accidentally witnessed her mother's assassination. According to the girl, she heard screams and noise coming from her parents' room and ran there. She cracked open the door and saw her father kneeling behind the bed. Her mother was likely lying on the floor, but Yasmina couldn't see her from the doorway. Muhammad yelled at his daughter, ordering her to leave immediately, shut the door behind her, and go to bed. In the morning, he told the girls that their mother had left. Yasmina, despite her age, understood something terrible had happened, but couldn't imagine that her father had taken their mother's life. A confession, trial, and sentence. To spare his daughter from having to testify in court, the accused confessed and recounted what happened that dreadful evening. According to him, he and his wife argued about her infidelity and desire for a divorce. Muhammad claimed he didn't mean to harm Alana, but things escalated spontaneously. The argument turned physical, and she tried to call the police, but he knocked the phone from her hand. She began screaming, and Muhammad struck her multiple times in the face, then pinned her to the floor and strangled her with his hands. At this moment, their daughter walked in but couldn't see what was happening due to the bed. When Muhammad realized his wife wasn't breathing, he attempted to resuscitate her, but it was in vain, as in his rage he had broken her neck. He then put her body in a large suitcase, loaded it into the trunk of his car, and drove around aimlessly for hours, unsure of what to do next. Upon reaching a small bridge over a river, he decided to throw the suitcase down, hoping the current would carry it away, making it impossible to find. However, in the darkness, he didn't see that the suitcase got stuck against the bridge's foundation. In fall 2017, while the trial of the criminal surgeon was underway, a new scandal erupted involving his father, Shamji, who made disparaging remarks about his deceased daughter-in-law. He attempted to justify his son's actions, saying his wife had been unfaithful and provoked him. These comments led to an investigation into the elderly man, and his medical license was revoked. In April 2019, Muhammad was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, though with the possibility of parole in 14 years. Given the time served during the trial, he may be released as early as 2030. Moreover, Muhammad was forbidden from contacting his children or Alana's parents and ordered to pay them a large sum as compensation. He was also permanently stripped of his medical license. Sarah Ann Wood was born on March 4, 1981, in New York. She grew up in a religious family. Her father was a pastor in a small town in the middle of the state. From a young age, Sarah, along with her older sister and brother, attended services at her father's church and went to Sunday school. She enjoyed dancing, loved poetry, and was a member of her school's cheerleading team. Sarah also loved riding her bike and often used it to get to her father's church. It was less than a mile from her home, and Sarah regularly rode there for services, Sunday school, or just to help her father with something. On August 18, 1993, when she was 12, Sarah, as usual, rode her bike to church for Sunday school. The classes were conducted by other church members while her father stayed home. Her parents expected Sarah to return that afternoon right after the classes. But as time passed and she didn't come back, they began to worry. After waiting a little longer, they headed to the church, thinking Sarah might have stayed behind with other kids, but she wasn't there. The Sunday school teacher said that she had left on her bike right after classes. They also mentioned that she took with her a few books, some colorful folders, and a small display board. Her parents grew even more concerned because the ride home from church should have only taken a few minutes, and it was unlikely Sarah would have gone anywhere else with all those items. Moreover, she always stopped by to ask for permission if she wanted to go somewhere else. Her parents followed the route to the church, asking neighbors if anyone had seen their daughter. Since it was a small town and Sarah's father was well known through the church, dozens of people quickly joined the search. They soon found a witness who had seen Sarah riding towards her house around 2:30 p.m. She was spotted just a few hundred yards from her home, which made her parents even more anxious. They were almost certain something bad had happened to Sarah and decided to contact the police. The local police department immediately began the search, deploying dozens of officers. The sheriff also asked the fire department for assistance and they joined the effort. News of Sarah's disappearance quickly spread throughout the area, bringing in dozens of volunteers. In just the first few hours, several hundred people were already involved in the search. The police focused on the route from the church to Sarah's home, scouring the fields and woods on both sides of the road. They soon found the first alarming clue. Just a few yards into the woods, they discovered Sarah's bike leaning against a tree. The police focused on that area and soon found the items Sarah had taken from Sunday school, hidden under a bush. These discoveries led investigators to a grim conclusion. It was likely that Sarah had been abducted. They assumed that an unknown assailant might have dragged her from the road into the woods, left her belongings there, and then taken her away by car. The police department threw all its resources into the search, while Sarah's relatives, who couldn't sit still and wait, began printing flyers with information about her disappearance. With the assistance of dozens of volunteers, they distributed these flyers not only in their town, but also in neighboring cities. Despite all the efforts, the first day of the search ended with no results. Police and volunteers combed the area within several miles of the road until nightfall, but unfortunately, they didn't find any new clues. The search continued the next morning with even more people joining in. The state police also got involved, focusing on finding a possible suspect. Investigators questioned all the town's residents, hoping someone might have seen a stranger or a vehicle that could be connected to Sarah's disappearance. Sarah's parents organized an improvised headquarters, staffed by dozens of volunteers. They printed and distributed flyers, while also trying to find witnesses or any leads that might bring them closer to finding Sarah. Local media soon began covering the case, and in the following days, news of Sarah's disappearance spread nationwide. The police received more than 1,000 tips and thoroughly checked each one, but they repeatedly hit dead ends. Concerned residents helped the parents raise a substantial $150,000 reward for any information about Sarah's whereabouts, but unfortunately, this also led nowhere. The active phase of the search continued for about a week, but eventually the police concluded that they were unlikely to find any valuable leads in the area. They continued to work on the case, now focusing on finding a potential suspect. Detectives checked local residents and convicted criminals from neighboring towns, but nothing yielded results. Sarah's disappearance was featured on 2 popular national television shows, leading to a new wave of tips. Her parents also made regular appeals to the public through the media, asking for any information about their daughter's whereabouts, but her fate remained unknown. This continued for nearly 6 months until something quite unexpected happened. On the morning of January 7, 1994, a 12-year-old girl named Rebecca left her home in a small town in Massachusetts and started walking to school. While walking down a deserted street, she noticed a man walking alongside her. He said something, but Rebecca didn't hear him because she was wearing headphones. When she took them off, the man pulled out a gun and told her that if she did everything he said, he wouldn't hurt her. He grabbed her by the jacket and they continued walking in the same direction. Rebecca was afraid to scream or try to run, but she understood that even if she complied, the man might still kill her. Soon, she realized the man was leading her to a car and quickly came up with a plan. She pretended to have an asthma attack and struggled to breathe. Rebecca sat down on the ground and the man let go of her jacket. He grabbed the edge of her backpack while she continued to act as if she was suffocating, and at the right moment, she slipped out of the backpack straps and ran away from the kidnapper. A few hundred yards away, Rebecca spotted several adults. She ran to them and said that someone had just tried to abduct her. Meanwhile, the kidnapper got into his car and drove off, taking Rebecca's backpack with him. One of the witnesses decided to follow him in his own car. He tailed the kidnapper for a few minutes, then stopped at the nearest gas station and called the police. The witness provided them with a partial license plate number of the kidnapper's car and its model, while Rebecca described his appearance. The police began searching for the vehicle, checking databases for matching cars. They also sent out information to nearby towns, and on that same evening, their efforts paid off. An officer driving through a small town a few miles away suddenly noticed a vehicle matching the description. He stopped and knocked on the door of the house where it was parked. There were several people inside, and the officer asked who owned the pickup truck. The vehicle's owner explained that he hadn't used it in a long time because he had lost his sight. Instead, his neighbor, 43-year-old Lewis Lent, often used the truck. Lewis was a handyman who helped the blind neighbor with various household chores in exchange for using the pickup. Lewis said that the last time he drove the truck was the previous day, and he hadn't used it since. Despite this, the officer asked him to come to the station for questioning, and Lewis agreed. The man continued to insist that he hadn't used the pickup that day. He denied any involvement in the attempted abduction, claiming that he was a devout Christian who spent most of his free time at church and would never do something like that. While Lewis was at the station, the police took his photograph and showed it to Rebecca and other witnesses in a photo lineup mixed with pictures of other men. They all unanimously identified Lewis as the kidnapper. Rebecca, who had seen him up close, since he was less than a yard away from her, stated she had no doubt that he was the one who tried to abduct her. Investigators quickly obtained a warrant to search Lewis's house and the vehicles. In the pickup truck owned by his neighbor, they made quite a disturbing discovery. There was a small bag containing duct tape, a knife, children's sunglasses, and candy. In the van, which belonged to Lewis and was also parked near the house, police found a gun and Rebecca's backpack. Inside the house, investigators found something even more startling: a large secret room dug out beneath the house, which was still under construction. With all this evidence, the police arrested Lewis for the attempted abduction. Initially, he continued to insist on his innocence, but pretty soon decided to confess to everything. He admitted that he traveled to Rebecca's town looking for a victim, bringing along his so-called kidnapping bag that he always kept in his car. Lewis then explained the purpose of the secret room he was digging under his house, and his story shocked even the police. He revealed that he planned to turn it into a full-fledged bunker where he intended to hold kidnapped victims. Lewis said he aimed to abduct 11 girls, aged 12 to 17, to satisfy his horrific fantasies. He added that until the room was finished, he didn't plan to keep his victims there long, intending to kill them within a few days. In Lewis's house, the police also found a list of several names. Upon identifying these individuals, they realized all of them were children living not far from Lewis's home. It appeared that Lewis had been considering them as potential future victims once he completed the secret room. After his confession, Lewis was placed in jail awaiting trial for attempted abduction. Investigators continued to visit him to gather additional information, and during one of these visits, he unexpectedly confessed to another crime. Lewis revealed that 4 years prior, in October 1990, he was working as a janitor at a movie theater in the same town where he later attempted to kidnap Rebecca. On the evening of October 22nd, he left work and saw 12-year-old James Bernardo riding his bike near the parking lot. Lewis immediately decided to abduct him with the intent of assaulting him. There were no witnesses in the parking lot, and he had a bag with his kidnapping kit in the van, the same one that police later found during the search. Lewis offered him $5 to help set up chairs in the movie theater, and James agreed. Lewis led him to the empty theater where he tied him up. He then drove his van closer to the entrance, dragged the boy and his bike inside, and took him to his home. He left the boy there and drove to a nearby lake to get rid of the bike. After throwing it into the water, Lewis returned home and attempted to assault the boy, but was unsuccessful, so he decided to dispose of the victim. He dragged him into his van and drove to a neighboring state, where he killed him and left the body in the forest. It was soon discovered by a hunter who reported it to the police. However, over the course of several years, detectives were unable to get closer to identifying the culprit. Now, comparing Lewis's statement with the case materials, they found that he provided a vast amount of facts and details about this crime that perfectly matched reality. After Lewis's confession, news about him spread quickly throughout the whole country. In just a few days, police realized they were dealing with a man who not only tried to abduct a girl and was building a secret bunker for other victims, but also confessed to a murder no one suspected him of. Investigators in New York, who were searching for Sarah Wood, also heard about Lewis's case. They looked into the details of Rebecca's abduction attempt and requested more information about Lewis himself. Before that, profilers had created a profile of Sarah's potential abductor, and Lewis seemed to fit it quite well. The investigators decided to talk to him and went to the prison. During the interrogation, he mentioned that he often traveled to the neighboring state because he had close relatives living there. Lewis also said that sometimes during these trips, he drove through small towns looking for victims, and on August 18, 1993, he noticed Sarah. According to him, she was walking along the road with her bike beside her. Lewis pulled up next to her, got out of the car, and used a gun to force her into the van. He tied her up, then dragged her belongings and bike a few yards off the road into the woods so they wouldn't be found too quickly. After that, he drove Sarah to the mountains, hundreds of miles from her home. He stopped in a remote area by a large lake, where he assaulted and killed her. Lewis dug a hole and buried her body. He also mentioned that he wasn't sure if she had actually died or was just unconscious while he was doing that. But for some reason, Lewis refused to disclose the exact burial location. However, like with his other victim, he provided detectives with a wealth of details, leaving no doubt that he was indeed responsible for this crime. Police began searching the area around the lake, involving hundreds of volunteers, park rangers, and even the military. However, they faced an obvious problem. Given the enormous size of the lake, even with such an impressive search team, it was practically impossible to cover the entire area. Moreover, Months had passed since the burial, and the location could have become overgrown with grass. After several weeks of searching, they failed to find either the body or any evidence. Nevertheless, detailed testimony with precise details of the abduction was enough to charge Lewis with the murders of both Sarah and 12-year-old James. In January 1995, Lewis was sentenced to 17 to 20 years in prison for the attempted abduction of Rebecca. The following June, the trial for James's murder began, and Lewis pleaded guilty before the judge. He also told his lawyer that he wanted to confess to Sarah's murder immediately, but when he entered the courtroom and saw her parents, he suddenly changed his mind. However, just 9 days later, when he was brought into an empty courtroom, he finally admitted his guilt. Despite this, he continued to refuse to disclose the burial site, despite desperate pleas from Sarah's parents. Eventually, the prosecution offered him a deal. In exchange for information about Sarah's whereabouts, they promised him that he would serve his sentence not in a federal prison, but in a state one, as Lewis wanted. He agreed and began working with investigators. Lewis pointed out a specific area near the lake and even drew a rough map. The police also wanted to take him along on the search, but his lawyer advised against it. The police organized extensive searches in this area despite the snow and freezing temperatures. They used heavy equipment and the help of hundreds of volunteers, but all their efforts were in vain. They weren't able to find Sarah. Several months later, when autumn came, the police made another attempt, but once again, they were unsuccessful. Throughout this time, detectives tried to get more specific information from Lewis, but he refused to disclose the exact location or help the police find it. Eventually, the prosecution decided to revoke the deal, and on April 11, 1997, Lewis was sentenced to 25 years in prison. It was the maximum sentence the judge could impose without the discovery of the body, but he added that if such evidence were available, he would have certainly handed down a death sentence. During the trial, Lewis's lawyer attempted to mitigate the punishment in all three cases. He did not dispute his client's guilt, but argued that Lewis suffered from an unidentified mental disorder. According to him, Lewis heard voices in his head and claimed to have contacted aliens, but experts found no evidence of any mental disease. They concluded that he was probably just pretending in an attempt to avoid serious punishment. After the verdict, detectives continued to visit Lewis in prison, hoping that he would finally reveal Sarah's burial site. He behaved quite strangely and gave the police different locations, often contradicting himself. Once, he stated that he was not ready to disclose the location because he had buried Sarah next to another victim and did not want anyone to find out who it is. Sarah's parents also visited Lewis in prison, begging him to tell them the burial site, but he continued to remain silent. Detectives were also considering Lewis's possible involvement in other unsolved cases. After he confessed to the abductions of Sarah and James, the police had almost no doubts that he had other victims. Almost immediately after his arrest, they learned about another attempted abduction he had made. Several years prior, Lewis had tried to grab a girl off the street, but her father intervened. They reported it to the police, but detectives couldn't find the perpetrator. Only after Lewis's photo appeared in the news did the girl and her father recognize him. Lewis was also suspected in 4 unsolved disappearances that occurred from 1985 to 1992. Investigators determined that he had the capability to commit all these crimes, but no evidence was found, and Lewis refused to confess. Despite this, his story didn't end there. Detectives continued to visit him after his sentencing, hoping he would reveal Sarah's whereabouts or confess to other crimes. However, this didn't happen until 2013, when Lewis suddenly decided to confess to another murder. He confessed that he is responsible for one of the crimes he was suspected of. According to him, on November 6, 1992, he abducted a 16-year-old teenager with developmental disabilities who was riding a bike to his grandmother's house. Lewis said he forced the boy into his van, then killed him and dumped his body in a lake. Investigators confirmed his involvement based on his detailed description of the events, but official charges in the case have not been filed against him to this day. Right now, Lewis is 73 years old and he continues to serve his sentence for 2 murders and an attempted abduction. Sarah's parents still believe that someday they will convince him to reveal the burial site, or he will disclose this secret before his death. The family also continues the work of the center they initially opened to gather tips and distribute flyers. Over the years, they have expanded to assist in other missing children investigations, a commitment they uphold to this day. Primarily focused on distributing flyers, their efforts helped reunite 399 children with their families in 2017 alone. In memory of Sarah, her relatives also organize an annual bike ride. Initially attended by just a few people, over the years, the number of participants has grown steadily. Currently, several thousand people regularly participate in the event, also helping to raise significant funds to support efforts to find missing children. Police have no plans to give up the search for Sarah's burial site, regardless of Lewis's willingness to disclose this information. They intend to continue search operations in the areas he has indicated until they succeed in finding her. On December 20th, 2017, a press conference was held during which Mark Perez, special agent in charge of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, announced a breakthrough in the disappearance of Mike Williams, a Tallahassee real estate appraiser who was originally presumed to have drowned while duck hunting on Lake Seminole on December 16, 2000, and was eaten by alligators. "Being here now, I can tell you what happened to Mike Williams," Perez said. "Mike Williams did not drown in the lake. He wasn't eaten by alligators. He didn't leave town and leave his wife and 18-month-old daughter behind. He was murdered. In the interest of the investigation, we cannot yet release details, but I am happy to report that this morning investigators notified the Williams family of recent discoveries in the case. Today's story is not only about love, betrayal, infidelity, and greed, but also about a mother's resilience. For 17 years and 4 days, Cheryl Williams, Mike's mom, disagreed that her son had drowned in Lake Seminole and pushed with tenacity for law enforcement to investigate her son's disappearance. She believed with all her heart that those responsible would be punished, believed even when no one else did. "I had two choices. He was alive or dead. I chose to believe he was alive, and I really think that's what helped me," Cheryl said on December 20th, 2017. "A lot of people called me crazy, but if I had given up, we never would have found him." The day before the press conference, Brian Winchester, a close friend of Mike and his wife Denise, who later married Brian, was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Mike's mother was right. Retribution came to those responsible, and ironically, they were the cause of the truth coming out. In 2000, Brian and Denise's affair, which began in 1997, turned into a murder, and years later, they went from lovers to strangers who didn't trust each other. Brian was very afraid that after the divorce, Denise would inform the police about what had happened to Mike, so he attacked her. Denise, on the other hand, went to great lengths to get him a life sentence. She was very persuasive in asking the jury for the maximum sentence. And it was these efforts that led to Brian having nothing to lose. And he made a deal with the prosecutor. Brian was sentenced to 20 years in 2017 for the kidnapping of Denise Williams, but he avoided a life sentence. Denise was celebrating the victory and was unaware that the conviction was part of a deal in which Brian Winchester, 49, admitted to planning the murder and a 17-year cover-up of the murder and received immunity from any prosecution for his role in the case. In exchange, he led investigators to Mike's body and gave a full and truthful confession. It would only be a few months later, and on May 8, 2018, Denise Williams would be arrested. At first glance, things are a little confusing, aren't they? Let's break down this case in detail. Jerry Michael Williams was born on October 16, 1969, in Bradfordville, north of Tallahassee, the son of a bus driver and a kindergarten teacher. Family and friends called him Mike, even though the family didn't have much money, and the boy, along with his older brother, grew up living in a trailer. Those were happy times. The parents cared about their son's future, and instead of building a house, they set aside money for the education of both boys, who themselves worked part-time at night in supermarkets. The sons enrolled in North Florida Christian High School. There, Mike excelled. He became student council president, played soccer, and was active in the Key Club. At the age of 15, Mike started duck hunting as a hobby and met Denise Merrill. The young lad was a soccer player and student council president. Denise was a cheerleader and council secretary, and they began dating. Friends thought they were a great couple. While still in high school, Mike became best friends with Brian Winchester, whom Denise introduced him to. Brian later had a friend, Katie Thomas, and the two couples remained friends for the rest of Mike's life. After high school, Mike attended Florida State University, where he majored in political science and urban planning. The lovers graduated together. Denise became a public accountant. Mike became a real estate appraiser. Mike proved to be a valuable worker. He often worked 15 hours a day, and of course his career took off. In 1994, the young, successful man married Denise. It was around this time that Brian married Kathy as well. All four of them continued to stay in close contact. Mike loved his wife dearly, strived to provide for their family as best he could, and had incredible energy. At the age of 31, Mike Williams achieved considerable success. As a real estate appraiser, he was earning nearly $200,000 a year. The couple was able to afford a home in a small, upscale neighborhood on the east side of town, and in 1999 became happy parents. They had a daughter whom the couple named Ansley. Mike's friends told me that he was always prudent. Since the young man was engaged in quite risky activities, he wanted to be sure that in case of disaster, his family would definitely be taken care of. Not surprisingly, Mike turned to his best friend who was working as an insurance agent at the time. Ryan sold him 2 insurance policies for $250,000 and later for $500,000. In 2000, Mike's father passed away. Williams was so stunned by this suddenness that, wanting to financially secure his own family, he again turned to a friend, helped Mike to insure his life for $1 million. Thus, about 6 months before his disappearance, the life of the loving father of the family was insured for almost $2 million. According to Denise, on the morning of December 16, 2000, her husband woke up early to go duck hunting on Lake Seminole, a large reservoir connected to the Apalachicola River. It was the day of their 6th wedding anniversary, and the couple planned to celebrate the date at night in Apalachicola, a small town on the bayou. The wife and daughter waited for Mike at home at noon, but he never returned. Naturally, Denise became concerned and called her father, who in turn called Mike's best friend, Brian Winchester. Together with his father, Brian drove to Lake Seminole. There they found Mike's Ford Bronco car near the boat dock, but Mike himself was nowhere to be found. The men went around to all the places Mike liked to hunt, but couldn't even find the boat, so they decided to call the police. After investigators from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Agency were called, the search for Mike began. A few hours later, a helicopter pilot found the boat drifting about 225 feet from the boat ramp. A search of the boat turned up Mike's shotgun, still in its case. Apparently, he never got to use it. The search became a rescue operation. Locals believe that before the 3 rivers were dammed to form the lake, the reservoir was the site of an orchard. Thus, the lake got its name Stumpfield due to the many remaining stumps that protruded above and below the water level, requiring careful handling of any motorized boat in the area. Because of this, searchers speculated that Williams hit a stump on his boat, fell out, and submerged himself in the water. His wading boots filled with water, and he probably drowned when he couldn't get out. Several other agencies were called in to help, including a dive team from Montgomery, Alabama, and the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. But the extensive and methodical search yielded nothing. Mike was never located. A week passed and the rescue operation turned into a body search operation. Teams were given probe holes to probe the bottom of the lake, and dogs were brought to the site. 10 days into the search, volunteers found the camouflage patterned hunting hat that could not be linked to Williams. Officials with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Agency speculated that Mike had been eaten by alligators, which is why the body could not be found. There were actually quite a few alligators living in the lake. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement found no signs indicating a violent death and agreed with that theory. After 5 weeks, the search was called off. The day after the search was called off, Denise held a memorial service for Mike less than 2 months after the alleged accident. It seemed to everyone that Denise had come to terms with the loss of her husband, but Mike's mother had not. 6 months later, In June 2001, an angler discovered wading boots floating in the lake. Divers searched the lake area and retrieved a lightweight hunting jacket and flashlight from the bottom. In one of the jacket's pockets was a hunting license with Williams's name and signature. The find raised many questions. Neither the hunting jacket nor the boots had visible teeth marks indicative of an alligator attack. None of the items found showed signs of having been in the water for 6 months. The boots were not slimy and the flashlight still worked. However, a week later, Denise's attorney asked the court to declare Mike Williams dead. Based on the items found, he suggested that alligators and other aquatic life had swallowed the body whole. The motion was granted. The death certificate said Mike died on December 16, 2000. Cause of death: accidental drowning while duck hunting on Lake Seminole. The body has yet to be recovered. This is how Mike Williams' story might have ended if not for Cheryl Williams, who refused to give up and continued to search for her son. "All I know is that I can't stop looking for him until I find him," she said. Cheryl's efforts seriously strained her relationship with her former sister-in-law. Denise demanded she stop searching and accept reality. She said, "I'm tired of seeing articles about Mike and his disappearance. I just want to move on with my life. If you keep pushing this investigation, you will never see your granddaughter again." Cheryl couldn't give up on her son, and Denise carried out her threat. If not for the mother's persistence, her son's story might have remained submerged at the bottom of a dark, algae-covered lake. It took Cheryl Williams 3 years to convince law enforcement officials to open an investigation into her young son's disappearance. "I made phone calls, put up signs about my missing son, wrote to the governor of Florida every day, compiled my notes into an evidence book, asked people to post on social media, and contacted reporters." Cheryl will tell you years later. The persistent mother contacted Matthew Oresco, an alligator expert. In his response, he explained that alligators do not feed during the cold winter months. Cold weather causes water temperatures to drop, so alligators don't feed in the winter. All they do is maintain their body temperature. 14 degrees is too cold for an alligator to be interested in food at all. Moreover, Oresco wrote that after an alligator kill, there is always forensic evidence left behind. Eventually, after 3 years, Cheryl Williams convinced law enforcement to drop the ridiculous alligator theory and launch an official investigation into her son's disappearance. The case was reopened because of little-known facts regarding alligators' eating habits, evidence gathered from interviews, and a little official data convinced investigators that Williams' death was no accident. "My gut feeling is that Mike did not die in Lake Seminole. And that's the general consensus of all the law enforcement agencies working on this case," said Rami Austin, a former investigator with the 2nd District State's Attorney's Office who prosecuted Mike's case. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Agency initially took over the case because Williams was considered a missing hunter. Officers spent 735 hours searching a 10-acre section of the lake for the body, but didn't spend a minute looking for signs of wrongdoing. Jackson County Sheriff's deputies brought in to help with the search also did not consider other possibilities. Investigators interviewed everyone involved in the search and police officer, David Arnett, who was present at the scene that day. Years later said, "Some things immediately look strange. Williams didn't usually hunt alone. His truck was found in an undeveloped area from which he would have had to drag the boat over mud, not on the nearby concrete boat launch he usually used. A terrible storm that night should have pushed the boat to the east shore, but it was found on the west shore. The boat's motor wasn't running, but it was full of gasoline. If Mike had been driving the boat and fell out of it, it would have continued to float in circles until it ran out of gas." Unfortunately, law enforcement began to doubt too late that they were dealing with a simple drowning. The crime scene had already been trampled by numerous volunteers and searchers. A car that could have served as a clue was taken by the family without any verification. Potential witnesses were missed. Denise Williams and Brian Winchester became suspicious to investigators because they learned that Winchester had divorced his wife Kathy and married Denise. They also learned of Denise's unexpected financial gain of nearly $2 million from her late husband's life insurance policy. Detectives determined that it was Winchester who sold the policy to Mike. They also found it strange that Denise, as Mike's wife, did not want to have anything to do with the investigation and tried to prevent Cheryl's activity, even forbidding the grandmother to communicate with her granddaughter. In 2005, the newly married couple were called in for questioning, which gave nothing new to the investigation. Brian provided an alibi for the morning of the disappearance of Mike Williams. He said he was 60 miles from the lake, at home in bed, as his ex-wife Kathy could attest. He said he had intended to go hunting with his father-in-law in the morning, but overslept. Denise's interrogation also yielded no new leads. In 2008, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement announced that Mike's disappearance was not an accident, and they believe he was the victim of a crime. However, without sufficient evidence, they, alas, cannot prosecute. We have suspicions, but we need proof. Another investigation failed to find out her son's fate, but Cheryl Williams did not give up again. Her efforts led to the Discovery Cable Channel doing a story on Mike's disappearance and subsequent investigations in late 2011. By then, Cheryl had become disillusioned with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, believing it was either incompetent or uninterested in solving the case. Beginning in 2012, Mike's mother wrote about one letter a day to the governor, Rick Scott, asking him to either assign the investigation to another agency or appoint a special prosecutor to do so. Cheryl sent 2,600 letters to the governor over 9 years. In 2012, Denise caught Brian cheating, and they broke up. The following year, Denise filed for divorce. After a few more years, an appraisal of the former family home was to take place, after which even property issues would no longer bind them. This event was a turning point in Mike's case. Brian didn't want a divorce. Denise didn't want to continue the relationship. They were constantly fighting, and the Williams investigation was poking fun at them. Brian would call Denise, and she stopped returning his calls. He couldn't handle the stress level. On August 5, 2016, the day a real estate appraisal was due as part of a court order, Denise left her home to drive to work at Florida State University. While talking to her sister on the phone, she saw someone climb over the back seat of her car. Turned out to be Winchester. Brian pressed a loaded gun against Denise's ribs and told her to drive straight ahead. He said he had to do that because she wasn't answering his calls. Denise tried to calm Brian down, agreed with everything he said, and promised to give him a chance to save their marriage. Brian believed it. Denise assured him that she wouldn't go to the police and report what he had just done, and Brian got out of the car. As he got out, he took the brown sheet, plastic sheeting, bleach sprayer, and tools with him. It became clear that Denise had miraculously escaped death. Denise called emergency services. Brian was quickly arrested and charged with kidnapping, which is a first-degree felony in Florida, and carries a life sentence as the maximum penalty. He was also charged with domestic violence and armed burglary. The court decided to keep Brian in custody without bail. Cheryl Williams expressed hope that this development will lead to the solving of her son's disappearance case. Brian is not going to let Denise run around alone with all that money, she told the New York Daily News. I pray that he will tell us what really happened. And Brian did tell, bargaining himself an extremely favorable deal with the prosecutor and avoiding a life sentence. At first, I think we were all doing really well, but I wasn't a good husband. Brian began his story. One day, I found a note in my first wife Kathy's purse and realized she was cheating on me. I wanted revenge. We often went to bars and concerts with Denise and Mike. I had been friends with Denise since high school. I was never really attracted to her. But after Kathy cheated on me, I started looking at other women differently. The affair between Brian and Denise began in October 1997. One time, drunken sex at a rock concert quickly escalated to frequent secret meetings. We started meeting at hotels during the workday. We met whenever we had the opportunity. Brian recounted he did not want a divorce. Denise made it clear that she would never divorce her husband. Public opinion was important to her, and she did not want to share custody of her daughter. Over time, the affair became more than just meeting for casual sex. Denise and Brian thought of themselves as a couple, exchanging gifts and love letters. It became clear that they couldn't go on like this. They could not be without each other, and divorce was unacceptable to Denise. Her pious image was not to be harmed. Around this time, Mike almost died in a hunting accident. Brian saved him, and Denise suddenly saw a way out of the situation. After the deal with the prosecutor, Brian will reveal. The year 2000 prompted us to start talking about Mike and Kathy's death. Denise wanted it all on me, not her, and she wanted a scenario where it wasn't a murder, but an accident. She wanted death to be left up to God. That way she could live with it. After considering various options, Brian and Denise settled on a boating accident. In doing so, they timed the murder so that they could get the maximum possible payout on Mike's life insurance policy. They both realized that Mike had to be killed before one of the 3 policies expired at the end of December 2000. The plan was in place. Brian called his friend to go hunting. He said he'd found a great spot on the shores of Lake Seminole. Mike expected to go there with Brian and return home by noon to celebrate his anniversary with his wife. I told him that we were going to go to a special place and that he absolutely had to bring his wading boots with him. I had to make sure he took them with him because it was believed that if you fell overboard in wading boots, you would drown very quickly. The plan was to make death look like an accidental drowning. Once Brian and Mike were in the water, Brian pushed Mike out of the boat. But instead of sinking, he grabbed onto the stumps and began to wade through them to the shore. Brian panicked. I didn't know what to do. Mike started calling loudly for help. I didn't know how to get out of this situation. I had a shotgun. I was panicking, and I shot him in the head. I didn't think about what I was doing. Things didn't go according to plan, and I needed to cover up what happened. There was hardly any time left. I should have been back home by now and getting ready to go hunting with my father-in-law. No one knew I was at the lake with Mike, so I decided it would be best for me to drive home and pretend like I had overslept. I drove home and hoped that Kathy was still asleep. I entered the house as quietly as I could. Katie was asleep. My phone was on the floor. I went to bed, called my father-in-law, and apologized. Brian did everything he could to create an alibi for himself. Then he hid the body. Denise didn't know that Brian had shot Mike in the head and buried him. Brian tried to tell her, but she didn't want to listen. It was enough for her that her husband was gone. Denise wanted to go on living with the idea that it was God who kept him from swimming out and let him drown. According to Brian, they promised each other that neither of them would ever say anything. Denise and Brian justified what happened by saying that the main reason Mike was killed was because it was impossible for them to live together. We said the money was just the cherry on the cake, Brian would pronounce in court. Investigators learned that it was Brian who planted a hat, boots, flashlight, and license. First, he needed to keep searchers from leaving a lake, and afterwards he needed grounds to pronounce Mike dead so Denise could get insurance, since a recognition process usually takes about 5 years. The lovers managed it in just 7 months. Including Social Security and other benefits, Denise received about $2 million. On May 8, 2018, Denise Williams was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory to a felony, which carried a life sentence. Denise pleaded not guilty to all 3 charges. In February 2019, she was sentenced to life in prison. 5 months later, Mike and Denise's daughter, Ansley, received all of her late father's assets and insurance money owed to Denise. In January 2020, Denise Williams appealed the conviction and life sentence. Her attorney argued before Florida's First District Court of Appeal that there was no evidence that she was involved in committing the murder. In November 2020, the murder conviction was overturned, but the 30-year sentence for conspiracy to commit murder was upheld. Denise is now in custody at the Florida Women's Reception Center. She will be 78 years old when she is released. Brian Winchester was transferred to Madison Correctional Institute in Florida to serve the remainder of his sentence. His current release date is set for July 30th, 2036. He will be 67 years old. Ansley, daughter of Mike and Denise, insists her mother is innocent and places the blame on Brian Winchester. She refused to speak to any media regarding the outcome of the case and her personal life. According to Cheryl and Nick, Ansley's uncle, they have not been able to connect with Ansley. Cheryl is very sorry that she has lost not only her son, but also her granddaughter. Tara Lynn Grant was born on June 22, 1972 in Michigan. She spent most of her childhood on a farm with her parents and sister. Tara loved being outdoors, riding horses, and helping her parents with other animals on the farm. In school, Tara was very active in sports. She was on the cheerleading and basketball teams and also played in the school band. After high school, Tara attended the University of Michigan, where she met a guy named Steven. They started dating and got married soon after her graduation. Tara, who earned a business degree, got a job at a large international company. Steven, on the other hand, planned to go into politics. He had been an assistant to a state senator during his time in university, but when the senator retired, Steven was left without a job. So he started working at a small toolmaking shop owned by his father. For years after their wedding, the couple had a daughter, and a few years later, a son. After their second child was born, the family bought a new house in a prestigious neighborhood in Macomb County, Michigan, right outside of Detroit. By then, Tara had made significant progress in her career, but it came with its drawbacks. She had to travel a lot for work, often flying to different states and countries, which meant she could only spend weekends at home with her family. Because of this, Steven took on most of the childcare responsibilities. His job at his father's company allowed him a flexible schedule, so he could spend more time with the kids. But it was still challenging for him to juggle work and childcare, so they decided to hire a full-time nanny. There is a special program that helps families find a nanny from another country who would live with them full-time and take care of the children. Thanks to her job, Tara could afford to hire such a nanny, and soon they found the right person. They hired a young woman from Germany who quickly got along with their children and took on most of the childcare duties. Steven, who got more free time, also started working part-time as a youth soccer coach. But despite the family's good financial situation, Tara's constant absence strained her relationship with Steven. She was only home on weekends, and they began arguing more frequently because of it. Tara hoped that after her next promotion, she could adjust her schedule to spend more time at home. But until then, she was away on business trips almost every day. This went on until February 14, 2007, when something unexpected happened. On Valentine's Day, Steven called the police and told them that Tara had been out of touch for 5 days, which was quite unusual. He explained that on the evening of February 9th, Tara returned from a business trip and told him she had to leave a day earlier this time, spending just 1 day with the family. This led to another argument between them, and Tara started packing her suitcase. A few minutes later, Steven heard her talking on the phone, saying, "I'll be waiting at the end of the street," before she left the house and got into some dark-colored car. Since then, Tara hadn't been in touch and didn't answer any of his calls. The police's first question was why Steven waited 5 days before reporting her disappearance. But Steven said he initially didn't see any cause for concern. He thought Tara just went on her business trip early and wasn't answering his calls because of the argument. However, over the next few days, he started to worry because she hadn't been in touch for so long. Normally, when she was away, she'd call the kids who were only 3 and 7 years old, but not this time. On Monday, Tara's boss called him and said she hadn't shown up for a meeting. This was also very odd and meant she hadn't gone to work. Steven called her relatives and told them what was happening, but they assumed Tara just needed time away from the constant arguments with him. She had told her parents several times that her relationship with Steven was getting more and more problematic because of her job, and they argued quite often. So, her relatives thought she decided to take a break from Steven and would soon come back home. As time went by, Tara still didn't show up, and she didn't answer any calls. Eventually, Steven began to worry that something might have happened to her and decided to contact the police. As Steven answered the police's questions, they noticed several suspicious scratches on him. Detectives asked if the argument with his wife had turned physical, but Steven denied it. He claimed that he often works with metal parts at his father's shop and gets scratched by them regularly. After the interview at the station, detectives said they needed to search their home, and Steven agreed. They arrived and found that all of Tara's belongings, including her documents and purse, were missing, along with her suitcase. Steven also gave them access to Tara's computer, where they examined her bank account. There were no transactions since the day of her disappearance, which seemed odd. If she had gone somewhere, she would have needed to buy plane tickets, book a hotel, and so on. But there were no activities on her account for the past 5 days. During the search of the house, detectives found no clues that could shed light on Tara's disappearance. There was no indication that she could have been the victim of any crime, so they were left trying to trace her movements since February 9th. The local police department had little experience investigating such cases because the area was considered one of the safest in the country. Most of the time, they dealt with minor neighbor disputes and other nonviolent incidents. They asked Stephen to undergo a polygraph test, but he was outraged by the fact that the police considered his involvement. He said he would never harm his wife and began to cry. The police left his house and began to consider their next steps. But the following morning, Stephen suddenly called them and said he was ready for the interrogation. However, just a few moments later, his lawyer contacted the detectives and told them that he had advised his client against it. The police obviously considered Stevens as the person of interest, as he was Tara's husband. Besides being standard practice in such cases, they simply couldn't find any other leads. Tara's relatives, friends, and colleagues all said they hadn't heard from her since February 9th and had no idea where she could be. There was no activity on her bank account either, although she would have clearly needed to make some purchases. Detectives began to think how they can interrogate Stephen and quickly found something interesting. His driver's license had been revoked, but he continued to drive his car. So officers waited for him to get behind the wheel and arrested him. But he once again felt like the police were treating him as a suspect and refused to talk to them. His lawyer quickly bailed him out and Stephen returned home. The police continued to search for clues and requested Tara's mobile phone records. Her last call was made on the day of her disappearance. She called Stephen from the airport and said she would be home soon. After that, she received numerous calls from Stephen, but they all went to voicemail. Detectives listened to these recordings. Stephen repeatedly asked her to answer or call back and accused her of neglecting their children. He also pleaded with her to come home for their sake. The phone itself was turned off, and based on data from the cell phone carrier, the last time it connected to cell towers was in the vicinity of Tara's house on the evening of her disappearance. Interestingly, the police found no incoming calls during that period. And as we recall, Stephen mentioned that someone called Tara before she left the house and said she would be waiting on the street. But despite this, from Stephen's voicemail recordings, detectives got a feeling that he genuinely worried about his wife and was angry with her for leaving their children. Although they didn't rush to rule him out as a suspect, but they couldn't find any new leads either. Stephen still refused to talk to the police, accusing them of wasting time on him instead of searching for Tara. Instead, he actively engaged with the media, which began covering the case from the early days. Tara's mysterious disappearance quickly drew widespread public attention, and Stephen appeared in front of cameras almost every day, pleading for her to come home. When information about the case reached the company through which Stephen and Tara hired the nanny, they decided to send her back to Germany. Before leaving, she gave a statement to the police and spoke positively about her time in their home. She also mentioned that on the evening Tara came home, she was at a bar with friends. When she returned home, she saw Stephen, who seemed upset and told her that Tara had just left the house. Despite Stephen's refusal to cooperate with the police, he hired a private detective, a former FBI agent who conducted his own investigation, but also failed to find Tara. With no leads on their hands, police decided to try a different approach. They contacted the company through which Tara and Stephen found the nanny, and here they found something interesting. Before hiring the woman from Germany, they had a total of 6 nannies, but none of them stayed in the job for long. Detectives spoke to them, and almost all said that Stephen's behavior seemed not only strange, but also frightening to them. According to their accounts, he rummaged through their belongings, asked intimate questions, and often yelled at them, treating them as if they were supposed to follow his commands. The police then wondered why the last nanny from Germany portrayed her time with the family in a completely different light, with only positive words about Stephen. They secured permission to monitor her emails and phone, leading to an unexpected revelation. Detectives uncovered messages between her and Stephen, revealing they had been having an affair. It emerged that the 19-year-old had been involved in an intimate relationship with him during Tara's business trips, which persisted until she was forced to leave the country. Although this was an important lead for the police, infidelity did not prove Stephen's involvement in Tara's disappearance, so they continued to search for other evidence. Speaking with Tara's relatives and friends, detectives learned that nearly all of them had disliked Stephen since she married him. According to them, he behaved quite strangely, tried to control her every move, and didn't get along with anyone in her family. Investigators soon learned something else. Stephen's former girlfriend, whom he had dated before meeting Tara, called the police and told them something interesting. According to her, Stephen had reached out to her several months prior, and their conversations gradually became more intimate. Eventually, Stephen began openly expressing his desire to engage in a romantic relationship with her, despite both of them being married. Stephen also complained about Tara and her constant absence. According to him, he suspected her of cheating on him with her boss. He even admitted to installing special software on her computer, which he used to read her messages, but found no evidence to confirm his suspicions. All of this made the police even more inclined to consider the husband's possible involvement in Tara's disappearance, but they still needed some evidence. When several weeks had passed since her disappearance, they began to consider the possibility that she might no longer be alive and launched extensive searches for her body. They enlisted volunteers and began searching the area within a radius of several miles from Tara's home, as well as a large park nearby. The search went on for several days, but it yielded no results. This continued until February 28th, when a local resident called the police. The woman came to the same park for a walk, aware of Tara's disappearance and the ongoing search for her body, so she remained vigilant and kept an eye out for anything unusual. Soon enough, she did notice something strange. Under one of the trees along the trail, there was a plastic bag covered with branches and snow. It was clearly filled with something, and the woman decided to take a closer look. Through the bag, she saw rubber gloves and something resembling metal shavings inside, and there was something dark red at the bottom. She decided to take the bag with her and handed it over to the police. Detectives immediately realized that there was likely blood at the bottom of the bag and sent it to the lab. But there was a problem. Experts warned that due to a high workload, DNA analysis could take up to 2 months. Nevertheless, they examined the contents and confirmed that it did indeed seem to be human blood. The police immediately focused their search efforts in the area where the bag was found, deploying all available resources. Stephen did not participate in the search, citing bias from the police. Instead, he gave a lengthy interview to a news channel, making quite a few questionable statements. He repeatedly criticized Tara for being absent from her home most of the time, labeling her a bad mother. Stephen claimed he took on almost all parenting responsibilities and was a better mom than she was. When reporters asked about their financial situation and whether he had been living mostly on Tara's money, Stephen became angry and insisted he didn't need a penny from her. During the interview, Stephen also accused Tara of infidelity without providing any evidence. Throughout the conversation, he repeatedly condemned Tara and emphasized how difficult their marriage had been for him. As Stephen was giving the interview, the detectives made some progress. They had previously tried to obtain a search warrant for Tara's home without success due to insufficient grounds, and Stephen had prevented them from searching it voluntarily. However, after the blood-stained bag was discovered in the park, the judge granted the warrant. The police arrived at the house, and around the same time Stephen returned after the interview. Detectives informed him of the warrant to search his home, and Stephen opened the door for them before calling his lawyer. The lawyer inquired if his client was under arrest, and the police answered no. Stephen then said he would take his dog for a walk, fetched it from the house, and left, while the police began the search. They went through room by room, eventually reaching the garage. There, one of the detectives noticed a large green container with several plastic bags inside. Slitting one open, they found an unknown substance, along with what appeared to be women's clothing. Opening another bag, the officer realized with horror that it likely contained human remains. In total, there were 5 bags in the container, and the detectives quickly confirmed that they indeed contained the remains of a woman. The police realized that they had found Tara's body, and Stephen must be her murderer. However, Stephen had not returned, so the police immediately began searching for him. They feared he might flee or harm someone else, knowing he was likely going to prison anyway. Meanwhile, officers called in reinforcements for the park search, as only a portion of Tara's remains were found in the garage. Over 100 officers from neighboring districts were dispatched to assist, and their efforts quickly paid off. Several hundred yards from where the bag was discovered, they found another part of the body, and later they found the head. Due to the cold temperatures, the remains were well preserved, allowing detectives to confirm they belonged to Tara. They found several more body parts, and as night fell, the search was suspended until morning. All this time, detectives also tried to locate Stephen, but to no avail. They reached out to his friends, and one of them revealed that Stephen had called him informing about the search at his house and asked to pick him up from the street. Stephen's friend drove there and took him to his home. On the way, he noticed that Stephen behaved quite strangely. He seemed scared, his hands were shaking, and overall, it felt like Stephen was on the verge of a breakdown. When they arrived at the friend's house, Stephen said he wanted to see his children and asked to borrow the friend's car. At that time, Stephen's children were in another state under the care of his sister. The friend gave him his pickup and Stephen left. The police requested information about his phone and credit cards, allowing them to quickly determine his route. They saw that Stephen withdrew money several times on the way to the neighboring state and called his sister. So the police realized he was heading to his children and immediately set off in that direction. Then something unexpected happened. The police received a call from Germany from the very nanny with whom Stephen had had a romantic relationship. She told him that Stephen had just called her and confessed to killing Tara. According to him, they indeed had an argument that evening, and Stephen started yelling at her. Tara then slapped him in the face, and he flew into a rage. He pushed her, and Tara hit her head after falling on the floor, resulting in her death. The police no longer doubted Stephen's involvement, but they still needed to find him. For several hours, they searched the area along the highway leading to the neighboring state, and soon they discovered Stephen's friend's car. It was abandoned near the entrance to the national park, but Stephen himself was nowhere to be seen. The police headed to the park, and several hours later, thanks to thermal cameras, they finally found him. Stephen was lying under a tree, wearing only light clothing, and the officers realized he was on the brink of death from hypothermia. He was in an altered state, talking to trees and muttering incomprehensible phrases, so they quickly airlifted him to the hospital. Despite the fact that his body temperature dropped to just 88 degrees, doctors managed to save his life, although it took some time for him to fully recover. While he was in the hospital, he was charged with murder, and detectives handed the case over to the court. It's worth mentioning that on the same day, his lawyer refused to defend Stephen. When asked why, he vaguely replied, "I need to be able to look at myself in the mirror in the mornings." Stephen was assigned a new lawyer, and meanwhile, forensic experts examined Tara's remains. One of the most experienced pathologists in the country, who had worked on J.F. Kennedy and John Benet Ramsey cases, was appointed as the chief medical examiner. After studying the remains, he concluded that Stephen's version of events did not match reality. Stephen claimed Tara died from a head injury, but the actual cause of death turned out to be strangulation. When Stephen finally regained consciousness, detectives went to see him in the hospital, and he told them what really happened that evening. According to him, when Tara came home and said she had to leave a day earlier, they got into an argument and he started yelling at her. When she tried to leave the room, he grabbed her, and Tara hit him in the face. Enraged, Stephen struck back, then strangled her. He dragged her body from the second floor to the garage and placed Tara in the trunk of her car. At the same time, the nanny returned home, and Stephen told her that his wife had just left him. The next morning, he took the body to his father's workshop, making sure no other workers would be there. Stephen destroyed all of Tara's documents and personal belongings, then dismembered her body using a saw. He also mentioned that he vomited twice while doing all this, but he kept telling himself, "If you don't do this, you'll end up in prison for the rest of your days." Several hours later, he packed the remains into plastic bags, placed them in a container, and returned home, leaving the body in the car. For a few days, he'd been thinking how to dispose of the remains while creating an alibi for himself. He repeatedly called Tara and left messages on her voicemail, begging her to come home. One day, he took his children's snow sled and went to the park where the bags with the remains would later be found. There, he placed the container on the sled to take it away from the crowded areas and started pulling it up a hill. At some point, the rope slipped from his hands and the sled rolled down. The container overturned and the bags with the remains spilled out. Stephen picked them up, put the container back on the sled, and after a while buried the bags under the snow in remote areas before returning home. Several days later, when the police began searching for Tara, detectives announced they were starting a search operation in park. Stephen panicked. He remembered that one of the bags, the largest one, was hidden quite poorly, so he feared it would be found pretty quick. So he walked to the park, took a few bags, slung them over his shoulder, and carried it to his father's workshop, leaving it right on the roof. The day before his interview, he took the container from home, went to the workshop, retrieved the bags, and brought them back to his garage. To his surprise, the next day, the police obtained a search warrant for the house, where they found these bags in the container. After that, Stephen confessed that when his guilt became apparent, he had not planned to surrender alive. However, he couldn't carry out his plan and survived despite almost freezing to death. Throughout the conversation with the police, Stephen showed no signs of remorse. On the contrary, he often smiled and joked, even when describing how he disposed of the body. While Stephen awaited trial in prison, his children continued living with his sister. However, Tara's family wasn't happy with this arrangement. Stephen's sister continued to communicate with him, feeling sorry for him, and even joked about Tara's murder. Eventually, Tara's relatives succeeded in having the children stay with Tara's sister, but Stephen's family still had the right to see them. The trial began in November 2007, and Stephen didn't deny his guilt. Nevertheless, his new lawyer tried to argue for a lighter sentence, explaining that Stephen committed the crime after many years of marital problems caused by his wife's frequent absence. During the trial, it also emerged that Stephen lied about Tara's plans to leave a day earlier. Her boss said Tara had no additional meetings scheduled and was supposed to start her work at the usual time. Tara's sister, who spoke with her shortly before the murder, confirmed this. At that time, told her she would be home all weekend, as usual. There was also no evidence to support the claim that Tara was cheating on her husband. Her boss said their relationship was purely professional, and it was confirmed by their email letters and texts. Even Stephen himself admitted that he didn't actually believe it. The prosecution failed to prove that Stephen had planned the murder in advance. Apparently, he committed the crime in a fit of rage, which could have led to charges of second-degree murder rather than first-degree. On December 21, 2007, the jury unanimously found Stephen guilty, and he was sentenced to a minimum of 50 years in prison. Stephen's lawyer tried to appeal the verdict, but to no avail. Since then, he has been serving his sentence behind bars. But his story doesn't end there. Tara's murder attracted the attention of millions of people across the country, and Stephen clearly enjoyed it. While in prison, he began writing a book and planned to release it with the help of his sister. They even discussed the possibility of a film adaptation, and Stephen pondered which famous actor could play him. In 2008, something else came to light. Stephen's children told their aunt that they actually saw their father killing their mother. On that fateful evening, they came out of their room after hearing screams and witnessed the entire ordeal. When this information appeared in the media, Stephen's relatives accused the children of lying and continued to defend him. Also in the same year, it became known that Stephen's father, who unlike other relatives didn't support him, could not live with what his son had done, and his body was found in his own home. As of now, Stephen remains behind bars, and he will only be eligible for parole in 2058. Every year, Tara's relatives and friends host a marathon along the route in the park where she used to jog frequently, and her children are always among the participants. Despite their father's actions, they have found the strength to move forward and honor their mother's memory. In the midst of winter, when families gather to celebrate peace and joy, a sinister shadow loomed over the picturesque town of Dover, Arkansas. It was December 1987, a time meant for festivity and love, But for one family, it became a scene of overwhelming horror. This is the chilling tale of the Christmas killer Ronald Gene Simmons, a man who transformed the season of giving into a time of unspeakable tragedy. What leads a person to destroy what they once cherished? What darkness lies within the human mind that can turn a father into a monster? From decorated war hero to a man convicted of the worst family massacre in American history, we'll delve into the depths of a mind clouded by secrets and rage, where the line between protector and predator became fatally blurred. To understand the mind behind the massacre, we must journey back to the origins of Ronald Gene Simmons. His story begins not with violence, but with a seemingly ordinary life marked by service and family. Ronald Gene Simmons was born on July 15, 1940 in Chicago, Illinois. His father died of a stroke when Ronald was 3. His mother got married again in less than a year to a civil engineer for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who was transferred to Arkansas. Little is known about Simmons's early childhood, but it was a life that took a turn towards discipline and commitment when Ronald dropped out of school and enlisted in the United States Navy in 1957, and later the U.S. Air Force. Simmons served with distinction. Over a 22-year career, he received several commendations, including the Bronze Star Medal, the Republic of Vietnam Gallantry Cross, and the Air Force Ribbon for excellent marksmanship. But behind the facade of a decorated military man, there were undercurrents of turmoil. Simmons married Rebecca Ulibarri in 1960 in New Mexico, and together they had 7 children. However, the veneer of a normal family life was shattered in 1981 when allegations emerged that Simmons had been assaulting his 15-year-old daughter, Sheila, and had fathered a child with her. Fearing prosecution, Simmons uprooted his family, moving them from New Mexico to a desolate 13-acre tract of land in Pope County, 6.5 miles north of Dover, Arkansas, known as Mockingbird Hill. This property, isolated and ringed with a makeshift fence up to 10 feet tall, became a fortress of sorts, a place where Simmons could exert total control. The residents didn't have a phone or indoor plumbing. But what was it that drove a man of discipline and service to the edge of such darkness? Was it the fear of losing control over his family, the desperation to conceal his illicit acts, or something deeper, a more sinister aspect of his psyche yet to be revealed? The facade of the family man began to crumble, revealing a tyrannical figure ruling his household with an iron fist. The family, once a symbol of joy and unity, became prisoners in their own home. This descent into tyranny was but a prelude to the horror that would unfold, unraveling the chilling transformation of Ronald Gene Simmons from a respected military man to one of the most notorious mass murderers in American history. In November 1979, Simmons retired from the Air Force and military service. He did some low-paying jobs in the nearby town of Russellville, Arkansas. He worked as an accounts receivable clerk at Woodline Motor Freight, but had to resign after multiple reports of inappropriate sexual advances. He worked for about a year and a half at a Sinclair Mini-Mart, but had to quit on December 18, 1987 because of low wages. 2 of the elder children, Billy and Sheila, had moved out, got married, and started their own families. So by the time of the murders, there were only 7 people living in the house. The calm of the holiday season in 1987 was shattered in Dover, Arkansas, by a series of heinous crimes. Ronald Gene Simmons' descent into murderous madness began shortly before Christmas on December 22nd. The Simmons family home, once a haven of domestic life, turned into a chilling stage for an unthinkable act. Ronald Gene Simmons, armed with a .22 caliber pistol, commenced a killing spree that would become the worst family massacre in American history. His first victims were his wife, 46-year-old Rebecca, and eldest son, 26-year-old Ronald Jr., bludgeoned with a crowbar and shot, and he strangled Ronald Jr.'s daughter and his granddaughter, 3-year-old Barbara. Their demise was just the beginning. Simmons lay in wait for his other children, feigning a festive spirit, only to mercilessly end their lives, one by one. Later that day, the Dover school bus dropped off the younger kids for their Christmas break from school. In a macabre ritual, Simmons systematically strangled and drowned his younger children, displaying a level of brutality that defies comprehension. The youngest victims, mere toddlers, met a similar fate, their innocence stolen in the most atrocious way. Simmons told them he had gifts for each of them, which he wanted to give one at a time, then strangled them, and held under the water in a rain barrel. First to receive her gift was his eldest daughter, 17-year-old Loretta. His three other children, 14-year-old Eddie, 11-year-old Marianne, and 8-year-old Becky, were murdered in the same brutal manner. He then dumped the bodies in one of the cesspits he had made his children date days before. But the horror did not end there. On December 26th, as the rest of the world celebrated, Simmons' remaining family members arrived for a holiday date at unaware of the nightmare that awaited them. 23-year-old Simmons' son Billy, his 21-year-old daughter-in-law Renata, and their child were the next to fall victim to his unfathomable rage. Billy and Renata were both shot dead. Their bodies were left by the dining room table next to the decorated Christmas tree with unopened gifts and covered with their own coats and some bedding. Then their 20-month-old son Trey was strangled and drowned. The same fate befell his 24-year-old daughter, Sheila, her 33-year-old husband, Dennis, and their children. Simmons strangled his and Sheila's child, 6-year-old Sylvia, and finally, his 21-month-old grandson Michael. The bodies were meticulously laid out, a grim tableau that defied any sense of humanity. He then covered their bodies with coats. Sheila's body was laid on the dining room table and covered with Rebecca Simmons' best tablecloth. He wrapped the bodies of Trey and Michael in plastic sheeting, and they were left in abandoned cars behind the Simmons then embarked on a chillingly ordinary series of errands, his actions a stark contrast to the carnage he had just inflicted. He drove to a Sears store in Russellville to pick up Christmas gifts previously ordered for his family. That night, he went out for a drink at a local bar. When he returned home, he spent the night and the next day drinking beer and watching television surrounded by the dead bodies of his family. On December 28th, the killing spree spilled over into the town of Russellville. In the morning, Simmons drove a car that had belonged to his son, Ronald Jr., to a Walmart in Russellville and purchased a second firearm. Fueled by a mix of revenge and rage, Simmons targeted those he felt had wronged him. The violence was indiscriminate, claiming the alliance of acquaintances and strangers alike. His former workplace, a law firm, became the stage for his continued rampage. 24-year-old Kathy Kendrick, a secretary who had rebuffed his advances, was his first victim. She was fatally shot. The brutality continued at the Taylor Oil Company, where he shot and wounded the 38-year-old owner, Russell Taylor, who was also the owner of Sinclair Midi Mark, from which Simmons had recently resigned. He also killed a complete stranger in the building and shot at another employee before exiting the building, but missed. In Sinclair Mini Mart, Simmons shot and wounded 2 more people. He then shot his former supervisor, 35-year-old Joyce Butts, twice and wounded her in the office of Woodmine Motor Freight. She survived and testified later that Simmons had yelled at her during a previous argument about wages. The entire rampage lasted 45 minutes. 2 people were killed and 4 wounded. Simmons' final act was as perplexing as it was chilly. He said to the secretary in Woodline Motor Freight, "I just wanted to kill Joyce, just Joyce. I've gotten everybody who wanted to hurt me." Simmons surrendered to police without resistance, his spree of violence concluding as abruptly as it had begun. But the most heinous of his crimes were yet to be discovered. Simmons sat silently in his cell and stared at the wall. He refused to speak to investigators or even his attorneys. He didn't say a word during the interrogation. But when he was asked about his family, Simmons got red and started to well up. His lips started to quiver. The police got suspicious. They couldn't reach his family, so 2 officers drove to the isolated home. The investigation began on the chilling grounds of the Simmons family home. Here, detectives encountered a scene that defied belief. Family members' bodies laid out with a chilling meticulousness was a tableau that spoke volumes about the mindset of the killer. In the aftermath of this unprecedented massacre, questions swirled. What drove a father, a husband, a war veteran to commit such unspeakable acts against his own family and community? And what can we learn from this tragedy to prevent such horrors in the future? In the wake of the horrific murders committed by Ronald Gene Simmons, law enforcement faced the daunting task of piecing together a puzzle that spanned both family tragedy and public rampage. As the probe widened to include Simmons' subsequent attacks in Russellville, the challenge for investigators was to understand the connection between the family murders and the seemingly random acts of violence that followed. The evidence gathered was overwhelming. Firearms, witness testimonies, and Simmons' own actions painted a picture of a man who, after committing an unspeakable act against his own family, sought to extend his vengeance to those he perceived had wronged him in the wider community. In a case that stunned even seasoned investigators, the question wasn't just who had committed these crimes, but why. What drives a man to annihilate his family and lash out at the world around him? The arrest of Ronald Simmons brought an end to the immediate threat, but it was just the beginning of a quest for justice and understanding. The prosecution's task was to unravel the mind of Simmons, to present a narrative that could make sense of the senseless. As the investigation progressed, more disturbing details emerged. Allegations of abuse, control, and a life led under the tyranny of Simmons became the focus. Each piece of evidence added another layer to the dark portrait of a man who had lived a life of deception and brutality. In the courtroom, the full extent of his crimes would come to light, bringing some answers, but also leaving haunting questions about the nature of evil. What kind of man lurked behind the annihilation of his family and terrorizing a community? Simmons' life was marked by strict discipline and control, traits honed during his military career. But beneath the surface of this structured exterior lay a tumultuous inner world. Allegations of sexual assault within his family suggest deep-seated pathological behavior. Experts in criminal psychology often point to a history of abuse, either experienced or perpetrated, as a significant factor in the development of violent behavior. In Simmons' case, the blurring of boundaries within his own family coupled with a need for dominance may have contributed to his downward spiral. The isolation of the Simmons family at Mockingbird Hill paints a picture of a man intent on exerting absolute control. This isolation could have exacerbated existing mental health issues, creating a pressure cooker environment. What then triggered Simmons to turn to murder? The possibility of his wife seeking a divorce might have been the tipping point, challenging his authoritarian hold over his family. She had already tried to leave him on numerous occasions, but always returned. A family friend informed the police that Simmons' wife had been saving up money to divorce him when the murder happened. Simmons' wife had written to their son shortly before the killings, "I don't want to live the rest of my life with Dad. I am a prisoner here and the kids too. Every time I think of freedom, I want out as soon as possible." Simmons' actions in Russellville suggest a broader rage directed not just at his family, but at anyone he perceived as a threat or who had rejected him. His targeting of individuals in the community indicates a blend of personal vendetta and displaced aggression. Yet the absence of any recorded mental illness diagnosis leaves us with more questions than answers. The depths of Simmons' mind remain in many ways a locked enigma. Could this tragedy have been averted? In exploring these questions, we confront the unsettling reality of how little we sometimes know about those closest to us. After the chilling massacre by Ronald Simmons, the wheels of justice began to turn, bringing us to a courtroom where the grim details of his crimes would be laid bare. After a psychiatric evaluation, it was determined that he was sane and capable to stand trial. Simmons' trial was a focal point of national attention, a legal battle to seek justice for the unprecedented atrocity he had committed. The proceedings were swift, reflecting the urgency of a community seeking closure. In May 1988, stood trial for the murders outside his family, specifically the killings of Kathy Kendrick and Jim Chaffin. The evidence presented was overwhelming, leaving little doubt about Simmons' guilt. Simmons, who had acted with such brutality, now faced the consequences of his actions in a court of law. His demeanor in court was reported as defiant, a stark contrast to the calculated coldness of his crimes. On May 12, 1988, the verdict was delivered. Ronald Simmons was found guilty and sentenced to death by lethal injection, plus 147 years. Remarkably, Simmons himself requested that no appeal be made on his behalf, saying, "To those who oppose the death penalty, in my particular case, anything short of death would be cruel and unusual punishment." Because of this, he had to be separated from other prisoners on death row. His life was in danger as they believed Simmons' refusal to appeal his death sentence was jeopardizing their prospects of escaping their own executions. The second trial for the murders of his 14 family members began in February 1989. Here, the prosecution delved into the harrowing details of the family massacre, painting a picture of a man driven by control and rage. During the trial, a shocking moment unfolded. Lashed out in court, punching the prosecutor and attempting to seize a deputy's gun, an act that only outed to his infamy. This happened after Simmons' letter to his daughter Sheila was introduced, in which Simmons said, "You have destroyed me, and you have destroyed my trust in you. I will see you in hell," after she had disclosed that he was her child's father to the police. On February 10, 1989, was found guilty of 14 counts of capital murder. The judge, undeterred by Simmons' outburst, handed down another death sentence. This rapid succession from trial to sentence was unprecedented, reflecting the severity of the crimes. The execution warrant for Simmons was signed by Arkansas Governor and later President Bill Clinton on May 31, 1990. All visitors, including legal counsel and clergy, were refused by Simmons. On June 25th, he died via the fatal injection method he had chosen in the Cummins unit. This was the shortest period from sentence to execution to death in U.S. history since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. His last words were, "Justice delayed finally be done is justifiable homicide." Nobody claimed his body, and he was buried in a common grave in Lincoln County, Arkansas. As we reflect on the legal proceedings against Ronald Gene Simmons, we are left to ponder the balance between justice and understanding. The case of Ronald Gene Simmons is a stark reminder of the potential for hidden dangers within our own homes, and it's crucial to recognize early warning signs. FBI profilers and psychologists suggest vigilance for certain behaviors, patterns of control, isolation, and abuse within a family. These can often be precursors to more violent actions. In cases like Simmons, where the perpetrator isolates the family, the intervention of external agencies becomes critical. Neighbors, friends, and relatives meet to be attentive and proactive in reporting any suspicions. But perhaps the most profound lesson lies in understanding the human psyche. Simmons' case demonstrates the complex interplay of psychological factors that can lead to such extreme behavior. What led Ronald Gene Simmons to commit such heinous acts? The answer lies in a complex web of control, abuse, and psychological instability. His desire for dominance, coupled with deep-seated issues likely stemming from his abusive behavior within the family, set the stage for tragedy. Simmons' military discipline juxtaposed with his chaotic personal life created a volatile mix. The isolation and control he exerted over his family only fueled his capacity for violence. And when his authority was threatened, possibly by a looming divorce, it may have been the catalyst for the massacre. John Harris, one of Simmons' defense attorneys, said of his abused family, "I think he felt like they are going to take him out. He's going to take them out first." I think that was his mindset. Could anything have been done to prevent the carnage? In hindsight, the warning signs were there. Isolation, abuse, and a man teetering on the edge. Timely intervention could perhaps have altered this tragic course. Simmons' story is a grim reminder that behind closed doors, within seemingly normal families, the seeds of tragedy can grow unnoticed. People feared him even back then in New Mexico. They said he was strange, unfriendly, antisocial. He didn't have much to say. A friend of his daughter's said, he had a beer in his hand all the time. He had one little room he would stay in all the time. It was dark and seemed spooky and it stunk. Attorney John Harris also said that there was more than one person to blame. If authorities had successfully arrested him back in 1981 on the basis of his daughter's sexual assault, the murders likely wouldn't have happened. However, prosecutors at the time said they had dropped the charges at the family's request. Ronald Gene Simmons' Christmas week killing spree is the worst mass murder committed by a single person in Arkansas history. What were the underlying reasons that made Simmons annihilate his whole family that once formed the core of his identity? Karen Snyder was born on July 29, 1948 in the small American town of Cedar Lake, Indiana. She grew up in a very large family with 2 brothers and 3 sisters. In high school, Karen met a boy named Paul, and they decided to get married when she was just 17. Shortly after, Karen became pregnant, and in 1966, their daughter Paula was born. Even though Karen was only 18 at the time, she and her husband were ready and happy to start their own family. They moved to a town called Calumet, Illinois, where Paul's parents lived. The family settled on the same street as his parents, just a few houses away, allowing them to see Paul every day and spend a lot of time with their granddaughter. Calumet, with a population of about 25,000 residents, was located not far from Chicago and considered a very safe place to live. Karen spent most of her time taking care of their child, while Paul got a job at the local railroad. On November 12, 1966, Paul went to his night shift around 2 p.m. A few hours later, he tried to call Karen, but she didn't answer. This was unusual because she was supposed to be at home and couldn't have left their 2-month-old daughter alone. Concerned, he called his parents, who lived just a few houses away, and asked them to check on Karen. They walked down the street and knocked on the door, but there was no response. His parents didn't have a spare key, so they continued knocking for a few minutes and then went back home to call their son. Paul became even more worried and decided to leave work early to check if everything was all right. As he approached the house, his concern grew even more. The porch light was off and the blinds were tightly closed. This was unusual because Karen always left the porch light on for him when he worked the night shift. Paul tried to open the door with his key and realized it was unlocked. He entered the living room and was relieved to find his 2-month-old daughter sleeping in a playpen near the working TV. However, Karen was nowhere to be seen, so he began calling out her name while checking each room. As Paul decided to go upstairs, he tried to turn on the staircase light, but the switch didn't work. He made his way to the bedroom and turned on a lamp, revealing a horrifying scene. The room was in disarray, and there was blood everywhere. On the floor lay Karen, showing no signs of life, and Paul immediately realized she was dead. Recovering from the shock, Paul went downstairs, called the police, and took his daughter outside. While he was waiting for the police and ambulance, his parents came out to the street and saw him crying and pleading for help. Paul's mother grabbed the flashlight and rushed into the house, hoping to help Karen. But as soon as she saw Karen's blood-covered body, she knew it was too late to save her. Soon after, the medics and police arrived. The doctors could only confirm Karen's death, and the investigators began examining the crime scene. From the back door lock, they found shallow scratches indicating an attempted break-in. However, the door was still locked, suggesting the intruder initially tried to enter this way but failed. Next, they discovered a broken basement window with a trail of blood leading from it to the front door. Investigators speculated that after failing to open the back door, the intruder tried to enter through the basement and cut themselves on the glass, evidenced by the blood on it. The fact that the intruder didn't enter through the basement but went to the front door suggests it was either unlocked or Karen opened it herself. In the living room, they found more blood indicating that the attack likely started there, catching Karen near her daughter's crib. The blood trail continued from the living room, up the stairs, down the hallway, and into the couple's bedroom where Karen's body was found. The bedroom was a chaotic scene, blood everywhere, and many items scattered and broken, indicating Karen fought back fiercely. There was a phone in the bedroom, but it had been ripped from the wall. Police believe Karen might have run there ahead of the intruder to call for help, but she couldn't. In those days, there wasn't a single emergency number like 911. Local police had their own number, so detectives thought she might have dialed incorrectly in her haste. Investigators also found a blood-covered light bulb on the floor, which had been unscrewed from the socket above the stairs. It seemed the intruder did this, though the reason was unclear. Perhaps he unscrewed it while following Karen upstairs, giving her a brief moment to try calling the police. In the downstairs bathroom, police discovered a pile of bloodied clothes and various items. Among them were a pair of pants, a bedsheet, and a washcloth. Detectives speculated that the killer used these items to wipe the blood off his hands and clothes. It appeared he also attempted to clean himself with the washcloth or possibly tried to use it to wipe blood off the floor to cover his tracks. However, given the amount of blood throughout the house, these efforts were clearly futile. After using these items, the killer threw them into the bathtub and fled the scene. This indicated to investigators that he remained in the house for some time after the murder, although they couldn't determine the exact period of time. Detectives began their investigation and quickly ruled out the possibility of a botched robbery. The only missing items were Karen's blue wallet, containing about $50, and one of the bedside lamps, which had no significant value. Medical examiners found 124 stab wounds on Karen's body, most concentrated in the chest area. Such brutality suggested the attacker had personal motives. Experts identified the likely weapon as a knife with a narrow blade, similar to a stiletto, but police couldn't find it inside the house or anywhere nearby. Karen was fully clothed and no signs of sexual assault were found, but investigators didn't rule out that the attacker might have had such a motive, but for some reason was unable to carry it out. The time of death was estimated between 4 and 6 p.m. Since Paul discovered her body around 11 p.m., the killer must have left the house several hours earlier. Detectives began their investigation by speaking with the victim's relatives and friends. According to Paul's mother, Karen had mentioned being afraid to live in that house and said she wanted to move to Indiana where her parents lived. However, she didn't specify the reasons for her fear, and investigators couldn't find any more information. Karen's neighbors also provided an interesting observation. Their dog, which usually barked at the slightest noise, remained quiet that evening. With no other leads, the police turned their focus to Karen's husband, Paul. In such crimes, the spouse is often the primary suspect, so they began investigating him. After analyzing the evidence from the house, detectives concluded that the attempted break-in at the back door and the broken basement window might have been staged. The killer was likely someone familiar with Karen, but tried to make it appear as if a random intruder had committed the crime. This suggested that either Karen willingly opened the door to the killer or they had a key. Investigators began interrogating Paul while also trying to establish whether he had the opportunity to commit the crime. They considered the possibility that he might have killed Karen before leaving for his evening shift, as he had left home after lunch that day. They also checked whether he remained at work for the entire shift or if he had left at any point. Paul denied any involvement in the murder, but the police continued to view him as the prime suspect. With almost no evidence, they attempted to obtain a confession from him, repeatedly calling him in for questioning. But despite this pressure, Paul consistently maintained his innocence. Karen's funeral took place 6 days after the murder. Besides family and friends, detectives also attended the ceremony and soon noticed something weird. One of the pallbearers had a deep wound on his forehead and a bandaged hand. The police identified this man as James Barbier, a friend of both Paul and Karen. He worked with Paul at the railroad and had done some repairs in the house shortly before the murder. Karen knew James pretty well and might have opened the door for him. Investigators began looking into James and discovered that on the evening of the murder, he had gone to a local hospital with serious injuries to his hand and face, requiring stitches. This aligned with the evidence suggesting the killer injured himself on the broken basement window glass. James became the second suspect, and detectives brought him in for questioning. He denied any involvement in the murder, explaining his injuries by saying that he had been returning home drunk from a bar that evening, tripped over a stump in the dark, and hurt himself on some splinters. James' wife confirmed that he came home that night drunk, with a bandaged hand and a cut on his forehead. She mentioned that he was acting weird and was visibly shaken, but she added that James was an alcoholic and frequently got heavily drunk, so this behavior wasn't unusual. When police interviewed individuals who frequented bars in Karen's neighborhood, they found witnesses who had seen James there that day. However, they couldn't pinpoint the exact times he was present. When experts finished analyzing the evidence from Karen's house, they found something intriguing. As suspected, there were 2 different types of blood. One matched Karen's blood type, while the other belonged to a different blood type, the same as James's. Although this blood type match was not proof of James, detectives decided to arrest him, hoping he would confess. They also cleared Karen's husband of suspicion, as none of the blood samples matched his type. James continued to deny his involvement, insisting that his injuries were from his fall. The police hoped forensic experts might find some additional evidence, but they faced disappointment. The fingerprints collected from the crime scene were smudged, and without DNA analysis, they couldn't make any progress with the blood evidence. Eventually, they had to release James and continued searching for new leads. Since then, investigators have looked into several other suspects and interviewed dozens of people, but the case remained unsolved for many years. Karen's murder forever changed their small town, once considered safe. Residents remembered the brutal crime for a long time and wondered who could have committed it. At the time, police did not reveal the identities of the suspects, including James, so only Karen's relatives and close friends knew of his potential involvement. In later interviews with reporters, they said they truly believed James was guilty, but without solid evidence, proving his involvement was simply impossible. Karen's father passed away in 1973, 7 years after the tragedy, and her mother died in 1977. Neither of them ever found out who killed their daughter. Paul eventually remarried, and his second wife helped raise Paula, essentially becoming the mother the girl never had the chance to remember. Her relatives decided not to tell her how her biological mother died, trying to shield the girl from the horrific details. Paula later recalled that when she started school, other kids teased her simply because her mother was dead. A few years later, understanding that she might hear the truth from others or come across news reports, her relatives finally told her what had happened to Karen. In 1989, at the age of 45, Paul passed away from health problems, never learning the truth either. For decades, there was no progress on the case. Paula occasionally gave interviews to journalists expressing her hope to bring the culprit to justice, and mentioning that she regularly contacted the local police department to ask about any new developments. But they always replied that there were no new leads and the case remained unsolved for many years. This continued until the end of 2022, when one day the police received a call. A 29-year-old man contacted the police department responsible for Karen's case, inquiring about any new developments. The man explained that he had known about this crime his whole life, as his grandmother talked about it since he was a kid. It turned out they were distant relatives of Karen's family, and the man was curious whether the police had made any progress in solving the mystery. He said that he had been reading newspaper clippings about the case at work and wondered if there were any modern technologies that could help solve it. And this prompted him to reach out to the police. To his surprise, the police department decided to reopen the investigation following his call. Naturally, none of the original detectives were still around, so a new team began reviewing all the available materials from scratch. They discovered that almost all the evidence except the blood samples collected from the floor had not only been preserved, but was also well maintained over the past 56 years. This included Karen's clothing and various items from her home. The detectives sent all the remaining evidence to the lab, where experts began examining each item with modern tools. Meanwhile, the police re-interviewed everyone connected to the case who was still alive. 16 months after the investigation was reopened, detectives received a long-awaited call from the lab. Experts had found several drops of blood on Karen's dress and extracted a DNA profile of an unknown male. The police immediately obtained a warrant from a judge to collect a genetic sample from the main suspect, James, who was still alive. They quickly got his sample, sent it to the lab, and soon received confirmation. James' DNA matched the blood found on Karen's dress. This confirmed that James, who was just 21 years old at the time of Karen's death, had been in her home the day she was murdered, and had initially lied about how he got his injuries. On April 29, 2024, the police returned to James' home, and the 79-year-old man was finally arrested for murder. Upon being informed of the DNA match, James did not deny anything and confessed to the crime. While the police have not yet disclosed all details of his interrogation due to the ongoing legal proceedings, James admitted that he had known his entire life that he would eventually be caught. James has been charged with first-degree murder and was released on bail due to his age and severe health conditions. Given James' state, the risk of him fleeing was considered nearly non-existent. However, Karen's relatives were upset because they had already suffered enough seeing the killer live freely for over 50 years. As for the motive, it remains unknown. The first hearing took place at the end of May, and more details are expected to be revealed only after the trial. According to the main theory reported by journalists, James had feelings for Karen and was jealous of her husband since she married him. Additionally, James was indeed heavily intoxicated that evening, which may have driven him to commit the crime. Karen's relatives expressed their gratitude to the detectives for finally bringing James to justice. However, given his health issues, even if James lives to see prison, he is unlikely to spend much time there. Karen's daughter, who was 57 at the time of James' arrest, said she received the best call of her life when she learned that her mother's killer had finally been caught. She admitted she had lost hope and was surprised that the evidence had been so well preserved. She also revealed that she blames James for her father's early death. Beyond dealing with the brutal murder of his wife, her father had spent the rest of his life almost certain that his close friend was responsible, and it was very hard for him to see James continue to live freely. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.